Mr. Grover's situation, did you find it sarcastically funny or eerily familiar? Sad, that's a good term to use. It was kind of a little over the top. I don't think any of us are counting on $20 receipts to a donation or Easters and 2 Sundays in a row at some point in our life as a means that God is going to find acceptable. But let's face it, a lot of times we follow the same path. We think we're going to impress God somehow. So we're in the middle of this study, literally in the middle of this study, right in the middle. We've done 2, and there's 2 following this. And so this is the middle sermon of this series that we're doing called Living in God's Presence. And it's kind of an odd series for us because it's not how I normally go about laying out sermon series, because we're talking about what we usually call end-time things. The first week we talked about the return of Jesus, the thing that sometimes we tag it as the rapture or the second coming of Christ. And we talked about what that meant, not from a perspective of when he came back, but from the perspective of living in his presence, getting ready for that day. And then last week we took that choice sermon where we laid out all the choices that you can make in your life. And you're probably thinking, wow, you did that in 30 minutes? Yeah, there's only a few choices that really matter when it comes to living in his presence. And remember, I told you that living in his presence was about choosing your path. There's the wide path and there's the narrow path. And the path that you choose, keep in mind they all end up at the same place. They end up at God's throne. And that day that we talked about yesterday, we just called that day, the day of the Lord. And well, this week we're going to continue, and we're not so much talking about events. We're going to spend this Sunday and next Sunday talking about the destinations. Remember, God sorts everything out, and there are 2 possible destinations. And well, before we can do that, I kind of got to set the stage. I got to catch you up on the story, because there's an important fact that we gloss over when we begin talking about the topics we're going to talk about for the next 2 weeks, and we miss this. And it's not at the end of the Bible. It's actually all the way back at the beginning. It's in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. It says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them." So here's what you need to know to really grasp this particular sermon. You were created in the image of God. Now, that means a whole bunch of things. That would make an awesome sermon series at some point to go through all the things that it means when I say you were created in the image of God. That would be just totally cool to be able to talk about all that, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. But there's a fact that you need to bring out of that idea that you're created in the image of God. You're eternal. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be on this planet forever. I mean, we all have a limited thing. Everybody has a time in which they're going to physically not going to be on the planet anymore. But you do understand that this little sack of skin and bones and flesh and water, it's not forever. If you don't believe me, just grab a copy of the newspaper and turn to that page that we call the obituaries, and the page is full every single day. I mean, this just isn't forever. But you are forever. You are eternal. There is a part of you that is eternal. We call it that thing that we just sang about, it is well with my soul. So when this day is done and this time is done, then we have to think about the destinations, and the Bible makes no ifs, ands, or buts. They basically say there's 2. And that's what we're going to talk about the next 2 weeks. Heaven and hell. It's 2 destinations. Choice that you have to make. It's not something that you can do what Mr. Grover decided to do, and that is the day you get there, decide which way you're going to go. It's something that you have to make life choices all along the way. And the Bible talks a lot about both of these topics, and you got to start somewhere. As I figured we get the tough one over with first, and then next week we can kind of celebrate the easy side. So this morning we're going to talk about what the Bible says about hell. Now here's the deal. I, and you guys know this, am not a hellfire and brimstone preacher. Never have been, never will be, never want to be. I'll be quite honest with you. Jesus wasn't either. He spoke about hell, but it has very specific connotations to it. We'll talk about that. And here's the deal. Can you convince somebody to make a profession of faith by telling them about hell? Yes. Can focusing on that topic produce a godly life? No. Now, you probably say, what? Well, just think about this. If negative consequences could produce a positive output, then Adam and Eve would have never ate the fruit, right? Because what did God tell them? The day you eat of it, you will surely die. If negative consequences of just telling somebody about the negative consequences actually produce positive results, then you do understand that the nation of Israel, who had many experiences with the wrath of God, would have never wandered for 40 years in the desert. See, a lot of times we think this topic is all about going out there and telling people, well, this is your eternal destination if you don't do that, and then we wonder why people don't want to listen to us. Well, it's because Jesus understood the truth about how these things work. Now, that does not mean that we don't talk about this ever. It's in the Bible. It actually is 100% true. But just so you know, that's all I have to say about that. When we're done this sermon, this is the only one I've got in my quiver. Somebody come back and say, hey, look, I think you should preach a sermon on hell. Guess what? This is the only one that there is. This is the only one that has any meaningful application on why anybody would get up and talk about this particular topic. And so with that, we're going to dive into this idea of what did Jesus say about it. Did Jesus talk about it? Yes. Yes, he did. He uses the term that we translate in Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 18, and Matthew chapter 23. He uses that term straightforward. He used a term called Hades, and I'm not going into the doctrine of what's the difference between Hades and hell. That doesn't matter. But he does use the idea of Hades in Matthew chapter 11, Matthew chapter 16, and Luke chapter 16. That's the one we're most familiar with. That's the rich man and Lazarus. Okay? So he uses that term 3 times. And, well, all of those kingdom parables that we love to read, you know, we talk about the narrow and the wide path, and we talk about the 10 virgins, and we talk about the sheep and the goats, and we talk about all of those end in the same language, and that is that weeping and gnashing of teeth. There are 6 different parables that end in the weeping of gnashing of teeth, and then there are another 3 that talk about being thrown into the fire. And so, absolutely, Jesus believed in a literal place. Now, what he had to say was important, and we'll dive into these a little bit in just a minute. It's a place of great mental anguish. So it isn't just a physical thing. It's a mental thing. It's mental anguish. It's a place of great physical suffering. Now that blows away my mind because I'm not physical, I'm spiritual. But we'll get to all these pictures in just a minute. It's a place of great loneliness. That's important that we know. It's a place that's eternal. I don't care what the Eagles said. You can't check out anytime you like. They were right. You can never leave. And when we begin to look at this, and what he said isn't as important, and this is where I want you to get, who did he say it to? Now that's important. Because I want you to get your little pen out if you're filling out the little sheet in the bulletin, and I want you to fill it out just like I did. All, highlighted, circled, arrows, star, all the references Jesus made about hell were to the religious people. We had a term for them. They were the Pharisees. A few were made to those to the disciples when they asked questions, but all of them were made to people that already had a general understanding of God. Now that's important. It's important because when you flip that coin to those that came to Jesus and Jesus encountered that were seeking, hell was not only not the starting point, he never mentioned it. Woman at the well, didn't mention it. Zacchaeus on the road, didn't mention it. Even the rich young ruler that walked away, didn't mention it. It was never mentioned to anybody that was seeking a relationship with Jesus. And I find this fact fascinating, especially when I couple it with this. Of all the accounts of people choosing to follow Jesus, none, 0, were due to a message on hell. In fact, those messages caused people to want to kill Jesus. Wow. Did you know this? Jesus never used this as an evangelical message. He never went out there and stopped the man on the street and said, by the way, if you will accept me and follow me, this is where you're going. He never did that. But yet somehow we think this is the message that we're supposed to take out to the world. You do understand that we were put aside to share the gospel. Do you know what the word gospel literally means if I translate it? Good news. I'm supposed to be telling the good news. I hate to tell you this. This is not good news. Now, it is reality. But the fact and the context that we find these particular messages in is important because it's important to the people that are in the church. Because I got a theory on why all of this stuff was talked about. And so this morning I want to take a look at those things that we're talking about, what we call the image of hell. Now, I got to tell you something. I got to share a story with you. I know I've shared it before. When I was 12 years old, some well-meaning evangelical individual or family that lived down the street from us decided they were going to do an outreach event, and so there was a movie out, and this was in the late 70s, early 80s, and this was actually the title of the movie, and it was one of those things that they encourages you to go out and invite all of your friends and neighbors and all down, and they showed this movie, and it was supposed to be Images of Hell, and they invited a 12-year-old little boy to this thing. And it scared me half to death. It did. I went home and had nightmares from that movie. I mean, you're not supposed to subject little kids to images like that. I mean, if we want to put a rating on it, I guarantee you it would have at least been a good PG-13, if not an R. I mean, that was a brutal, gruesome movie. And you have to understand, they were well-meaning, but what they did was put some huge stumbling blocks into my life. They didn't encourage me at all. Matter of fact, it took me a while to sort all this out, and thank goodness I had a good church that I was riding the bus to, and I went and talked to them. That they set me straight on some things about how this works, but it was gruesome. So I'm not showing you these images because I'm trying to scare anybody to make a profession of faith. That's going to become very evident here in a moment. But the images are great. Great in the fact that they give us, the people sitting in the church, something to chew on and think about. And the first one is the image we get is fire. Now, I do want to go ahead and tell you they are trying to explain a very spiritual place in very physical terms. So I do not know that there's literally going to be fire, but I do understand the concept behind fire, because in Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, it says, "But the cowardly and the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexual immoral, those who practice magic art, the adulterers, and the liars," so notice this is a pretty inclusive list, they will be consigned to the fiery lake and burning sulfur. This is the second death. So the Bible talks about the idea of fire. And like I said, I don't know if it's going to be burning bright, because that would kind of mess up the second image that we get. But here's what I do know. You guys know from my past, I have fire issues. Well, I did when I was a kid. I've gotten over them, just so you know that. But I liked matches, and I liked fire when I was a kid. And I've set a few things on fire before by accident, not on purpose. But one thing I do know is fire is painful. Matter of fact, statistics say, and I don't know who they interviewed because I don't know how you would interview the person, but fire is the most painful way to die, being burned. And what was trying to be proclaimed here is you do understand that the idea of fire is that this is going to be something that is physically painful. You're going to be able to feel your choices that you've made. That's important. And then we get to the second image, and the second image is darkness. Now, again, I don't get it. I've been around fire for a long time, and fire and dark don't go together. If I light fire, fire produces light, and the second I have light, then there is no more dark. So the fact that the Bible is coupling the idea of fire and darkness together, that kind of tells me that maybe we are speaking metaphorically here. We got symbols here. We're not talking something that's literally going to be burning, although it might be literally dark, because darkness represents isolation. Matthew chapter 22, verse 13 says, "Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" Now, the other thing that you guys know I did when I was a kid is we liked to play in the dark a lot too. I mean, we just did. I mean, I played Ghost in the Graveyard in a little graveyard. I spent a lot of time I was a teenager with too much time on my hands. That's all it was to it. And I spent a lot of time in the dark, doing things that probably weren't good for me and probably weren't very sane. But there is nothing worse than when you're coming home at night and all of your friends have wandered off to their way, and you're the one that lived farthest away from your destination, and you begin to walk home alone and it's all dark outside. Man, your mind can play tricks on you. You can see things that weren't there, and you can hear things that aren't happening, and darkness all around you. And so you got to get the image. You got to get the image that the darkness isn't about not being able to see. Darkness is about isolation. You know, back in the 80s, the band AC/DC sang this song called Highway to Hell, and they talked about how it's going to be party time. You do understand, this isn't going to be a party. This isn't going to be a great big reunion where everybody's going to be high-fiving everybody saying, well, we made it in darkness. It's about isolation. You're going to be by yourself to think for all of eternity about the choices that you made. Man, I don't know if I want to do that. But that's the image that we're given, and this is an image that came from Jesus, and that's the other thing that we talked about, and we mentioned a lot of this last week, the idea of pleading, weeping, and gnashing of teeth. And I talked about these emotions last week, so it's going to be a very emotional time, because pleading is begging for some kind of a relief. Do something about it. Fix something. Make this better. Fix it. We've all had those moments when we've pleaded. The idea of weeping, when as we begin to recap, we're going to have to feel sorrow for what we've done. And the gnashing of teeth, that's the denial, the anger, almost like Claude Grover. What do you mean there's no place for me? You get it. It's going to be one of those places where you're going to spend all of eternity by yourself, pondering all those choices. And those choices are going to bring great sorrow to you. And you're going to plead, and you're going to gnash your teeth. You're going to weep. You're going to beg. But then the Bible says that there's a worm that never dies. Talking about endless decay. This is going to be never-ending. Where the worm that eats and eats them and do not die, and the fire is not quenched. It's just going to keep going and going and going. You know, when you get yourself into a situation, you're in the hospital, or people that have been in the nursing home have talked about this, and the fact that you lose track of time. You can't tell when waiting day begins and the next day ends, because every day is exactly the same. That's what this is about. Every day is going to be the same. There isn't going to be a wake up and go to sleep. It's just going to be one endless time, a loop of time, because there is no clock and calendar here. And when you're all done, you're going to live in eternal shame. You're going to come to the conclusion of regret. Now, shame is one thing. I've done some things that I should be ashamed of, and if you call me out on me, I would turn red and get embarrassed about some of the things that I've done in my past. But imagine feeling shame and never having anywhere to release it. It just has to stay internal to you. It says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and others to shame and everlasting contempt. And you know what? All of that sounds horrible, doesn't it? That sounds terrible. I mean, sure, we should be able to take a message like this out to the world and share it, and yet that would just make them, nobody wants to spend their time here, so it would be easy to convince them to go to the other place. Well, if that was true, then you know what? We wouldn't have empty seats. See, the fact of the matter is all of these images, what's so bad about hell? That's not even it. Huh? What do you mean that's not it? That it's going to get worse? Well, yes. Because you got to go back to the beginning to understand the ending. And well, we're going to go through one of those little passages in Thessalonians. And this is what it reads. He being God, will punish those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of the Lord Jesus. Please note that. It doesn't say those that doesn't go to church. It doesn't say those that don't do this. It doesn't say those that gave $20 to a charity. It says those who don't know Jesus. Okay? They will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. What's so bad about this? Well, remember what I told you at the beginning? You were created to be in his image. You were created in the image of God. You were created to be like God. You were created to live in his presence, and you were designed for a relationship with him. That's important, right? You were designed for this. This was the entire purpose of God creating. When he said, let us create man in our own image, God was saying, I don't need another puppy dog. I got plenty. I don't need another cow. I want somebody I can relate to. And so when it says he breathed into our mouths the breath of God, he became a living being, it means that we were designed to be in constant relationship with God. And, well, your soul needs that relationship. It does. You need to have the presence of God around you. Even those today that say they don't believe in God, they don't understand because we're not separated from him completely right now. Even when your life, remember last week I told you the parable of the wheats and the weeds. That even though you're planted in the same ground, so you're still receiving all of God's blessings, even if you are not part of the kingdom. That's Jesus' talk. That's what he said. But our soul needs that. And well, at this point, you're completely cut off forever. There is no point at which you can get back into God's presence. The rich man cried out from Hades, and he asked Abraham just to dip his fingers in and give him a little bit of water. And Abraham said, hey, look, there's a big gulf between us and you. And you know there is no way out. You can't get back into God's presence. That soul that we say it is well, it ain't well. Because it's alone. And it's by itself. And you know what? You're out of blanks on your little bulletin fill in. And just so you know, that's the introduction to the sermon. Huh? Well, good news, the sermon isn't that long. But I needed to make sure you understood all of this. Because here's the actual fact about this doctrine of hell. We don't really believe it. Let that ponder in your brain for a second. We don't really believe it. Now, you're probably thinking, preacher, that's kind of a big statement to say, to accuse me of not believing in something. You do understand this is the merciful statement. And now you're thinking, yeah, now we know why you scored a 2 on the mercy lesson, because you're not a very merciful person to tell me I don't believe it. But you understand telling you don't believe it is better than saying you don't care. Because if we believed it, if we truly believed in such a place, in such a faith, you would do anything and everything in your power to see nobody goes there. It would give a new meaning to what it means to go out into the world and compel them to come in. You get an image of somebody that is close to you, or even somebody that's not close to you, and you get an image of what this place looks like to them. A church that catches that vision, you know what? We won't have time to worry about whether or not we're singing that or that. We won't have time to worry about whether this is good or that's bad. We only have time for one thing, because guess what that is? Because we've got the vision. See, if I believe this, then it impacts everything I do. It impacts how I spend my time. Because every person I walk by and I see, I can get a vision of those pictures. You know why those images are there? They aren't there to scare people into accepting Christ. They're there to help the church understand this is what you're fighting against. Anybody, that's what it said in Thessalonians, anybody that doesn't follow the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, then you understand that is what God said, not me. It's not something that I wrote. I mean, I'm not even crazy about the topic. I'd much rather preach the fun stuff, but you do understand this is here and it's important to us, because guess what? If you truly believe in such a place, if you truly believe in such a fate, you would do anything and everything in your power to see that nobody goes there. You wouldn't worry about whether or not you're infringing on somebody's space. You wouldn't worry about whether or not you're going to turn somebody off because you're going to talk to them about Jesus. You wouldn't worry whether or not somebody calls you a Jesus freak. You wouldn't worry whether or not what it takes, because it would take everything if you catch these images. Man, you're probably thinking, I don't like this sermon anymore. Well, that's what it's about. See, this was never a message. This was not the part of the message that we should just go out there and tell all the world that this is what's going to happen to you. No, this is a message that we're supposed to bring into our souls. Bring into ourselves. And then we're supposed to look at the people in our lives and say, you know what? Not on my watch. No, I can't make anybody accept Christ But I can sure be the greatest witness out there, and I can keep going and keep going, because once I catch that vision, anything and everything, nothing else matters. There's only one mission left at that point. And that's what Jesus was trying to get through to people. To the Pharisees that were just interested in practicing Judaism and interested in keeping the law and interested in keeping the Sabbath and interested in doing this and just interested in saying, hey, look, we're going to follow the rules and we're going to do what we're supposed to do and everything's going to be okay. And the problem is they were only concerned about getting one person to heaven, themselves. And now Jesus comes along and says, stop worrying about yourself. Put your faith, put your life in my hands, and then you go worry about the other people in the world. Now, a lot of times we look at it and say, huh? I don't get it. And then we wonder, why do people look at us in the way that we are? Why do people act the way that they do? It's because they haven't gotten the message. Because we're too busy worried about whether or not we're going there that we don't think about who else is out there. And just so you know, that's all I got to say about that. There isn't another valuable piece of information I can give you about this topic. There isn't anything else that I can tell you that's new and different. There's nothing else to explore. It's really kind of simple. Either you believe in it or you don't. And if you do believe in it and you care about people, then you understand what that means about your life. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells 3 parables. Interesting parables. The first one is about the parable of the 10 virgins. In the parable of the 10 virgins, we end up with a bunch of people that weren't prepared for when Jesus came back. And you know what happened to those 10 people? Well, they were left out in the dark. And the weeping and gnashing of teeth. The second story we get is about the people, the 3 investors, the 3 servants. And they were supposed to go out and they were supposed to take the things that God gave them and they were supposed to use it to grow a kingdom. And 2 of them did and 1 of them didn't. And so 1 of them was unprepared to invest what God had given them. You know what the funny thing is? Guess where that one ended up? Outside where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then he goes a little further. He tells that story about the sheep and the goats. And he talks about at the end of time how the king is going to go out there and look at everybody and say, well, you're a goat and you're a sheep. And the dividing point is those that cared about people and those that didn't. I still find that the most fascinating parable in all of the Bible because it was all about could you see people in their lostness or not? And those that couldn't see it, you know where they ended up? Where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth because they just didn't care. Man, there's a message here. The message is that, you know what? If you believe it, it will impact everything else that you do in your life. Because if you believe it and you accept it, and you understand that this is reality we're talking about, and that God is true, and that Jesus said, hey, look, anybody that doesn't come after me, then you know what? They're lost. But Jesus, the good news. I came to seek and save the lost. I came to shine a light in the darkness. I came to give you life so that you can have life in the full. Those were the messages that Jesus took out to the world. Those were the messages that were preached to the woman at the well. Those were the messages that was preached to Zacchaeus on the road. That was the message that was preached to the rich young ruler. Come and follow me. And then, I'm just going to make sure you understand. Jesus gets the last word. This is what it says. John chapter 3, verse 36. 20 verses after the one that we know really well. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. But whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on them. I'd almost like to tell you to get an index card and write that one out and hang it on your refrigerator and read it every single morning before you head out the door. Anyone that is following Christ, well, they're taking that narrow road and they're on a path to the throne with God as their king, with grace as their judgment point, and they're destined to spend eternity with God. That's what we call heaven. By the way, it isn't about the images. It's about the presence of God. Did you catch that? The only real difference between heaven and hell, one has the presence of God and one has no presence of God. And Jesus tells us it's an easy choice. I'm going to ask the worship team to start making their way forward. And this is really simple. Easy. What's your destination? Where are you going? How are you doing? And if you've chosen, well, you know what, I'm going to be a follower of Christ, and I'm going to follow Jesus, and I'm going to live my life for him, then I want to ask you something. Have you allowed this doctrine to actually impact your life to when you look out this window and you see people in the world, you just don't see a bunch of sinners that are dying and going to hell. You see a bunch of people that God puts you out there to share the gospel with. And if you don't, you do understand that in Revelation it also talks about when, at the day of the great ending, that there's going to be a wiping away of tears. Where do you think those tears came from? Because we're not talking about wiping away the tears in hell. We're talking about he's going to be wiping away the tears in heaven. So you do understand there's going to be one brief moment in history when you are going to come face to face with all of the opportunities that you were given and never took. I got a lot of tears to shed. But you know what? I know how to make sure I don't have any more. And that is to go out and share the word. If you're here today and you've never accepted Christ, you're not following. I'm not here to scare you into this. Those images, they're not the reason you want to follow. You want to follow because God so loved you so much that he came and he gave his life for you. He died on the cross, he rose again, and he's now living in heaven. And all he wants is exactly what was back at the beginning, a relationship with you. I'm not here to scare you into this. But you know what? If you're interested about that relationship, we're going to do a time of decision. You can come forward and we'll talk to you about what it means. Maybe you're here today and you need to make these images a little more personal. Maybe you can put some names down and say, these are the people I'm committed. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure they understand who Jesus is. Whatever this time of decision is, this is all about what you need to do. If you please stand, we're going to pray, and then we're going to